The three dined together in the big dining room almost in silence. Musard and Philip Herodotus had not returned until after 6, and their first knowledge of Colwyn's presence was by some oversight deferred until they met at the dinner table. In the awkwardness of that surprise they sat down to dine, and Musard's half-hearted efforts to start a conversation met with little response from his companions. Colwyn was preoccupied with his own thoughts, which apparently affected his appetite, for he sent away dish after dish untouched. Phil hastened the service of the meal considerably, as though he were anxious to get it over as speedily as possible in order to hear what the detective had to say. As soon as the dessert was on the table he turned to Colwyn eagerly and asked him if he had any news. "I have many things to say," was the response. "In that case, shall we take our coffee into the smoking room?" suggested Musard with a slight glance at the hovering figure of the butler. "I prefer to remain here, if you do not mind," said Colwyn. Musard shot a puzzled look at him, which the detective met with a clear cold gaze which revealed nothing. There was another silent pause while they waited for the butler to leave the room. But Tufnell was pouring out coffee and handing cigars with the slow deliberation of a man sufficiently old to have outlived any illusions about the value of time. Philip Herodotus lit a cigarette. Musard waved away the cigar box and produced a strong black cheroot from the crocodile skin case. Colwyn declined a cigar, and his coffee remained untasted in front of him. "You can leave the room now, Tufnell," said Phil impatiently. "Do not return until I ring. We do not wish to be disturbed." Tufnell bowed and left the room. As he did so Colwyn pushed back his chair and walked across to the window, where he stood for a few moments looking out. A wan young moon gleamed through the black tapestry of the avenue of trees, pointing white fingers at the house and plunging the old garden into deep pools of shadow. The trees huddled in their rows, whispering menacingly, and stretching half-stripped branches to the silent sky. Colwyn returned to the table and confronted the two men who were awaiting him. He glanced from one to the other of their attentive faces, and said abruptly, "Hazel Rath is innocent." "I was certain of it." Philip Herodotus' hand came down emphatically on the table in front of him as he made this declaration. "I knew it all along," he added in additional emphasis. "This is an amazing piece of news, Mr. Colwyn," said Musard, turning earnestly to the detective. "Who, then?" Colwyn made a detaining gesture. "Wait," he said. "I cannot tell you that just yet." He turned to Phil, whose dark eyes were fixed on his face. "It was you who asked me to try and solve the mystery of your wife's death. It is to you that my explanation is due. Shall I speak freely in Mr. Musard's presence, or would you rather hear me alone?" "I can go to the smoking room," said Musard, rising as he spoke. But Phil waved him to his seat again. No, Musard, stay where you are. There is no reason why you should not hear what Mr. Colwyn has to say. Your advice may be needed," he added as an afterthought. "So be it," said Colwyn. "Then I had better commence by informing you that Hazel Rath has broken her silence. She has made a statement to the police, which, whilst affirming her innocence, does very little to clear up the murder. Her story, briefly, is that she went up to the left wing about 7:30, noticed that Mrs. Herodotus' room was in darkness, and went in under the impression that she might be ill and in need of assistance. She groped her way across the room to turn on the light, and she had reached the head of the bed and was feeling for the switch when a hand clutched her throat. She screamed wildly, and the hand fell away. A moment afterwards the report of a shot filled the room. She found the electric switch, and turned on the light. The first thing she saw was a revolver, Nepcote's revolver, lying at her feet near the head of the bed. Then her eyes turned to the bed, and she saw Mrs. Herodotus, bleeding from the mouth and nose. While she was attempting to render her some assistance, she heard footsteps on the stairs, and thought of her own safety. She switched off the light and ran out, carrying the revolver and the handkerchief with which she had been wiping the blood from the dying woman's lips. She was just in time to conceal herself behind the curtains in the corridor and escape the observation of those who were rushing upstairs. There she stayed while the rooms were searched, and was afterwards able to steal downstairs unobserved and gain the safety of her mother's apartments, where the revolver and the handkerchief were subsequently found. "This is a remarkable story," said Musard slowly. "Do the police believe it?" "They do not, but I have my reasons for thinking it true," responded Colwyn. The next step in the story of how this unhappy girl became the victim of an apparently irrebuttable set of circumstances through her own silence, has to do with another person's secret visit to the moat house on the night of the murder. That person was a man, who came to return to Mrs. Herodotus the necklace which we subsequently discovered to be missing from her locked jewel case. It is not necessary to relate how the necklace came to be in his hands. He had undertaken to return the necklace from London to enable Mrs. Herodotus to produce it on the following day, and it was arranged between them that when he reached the moat house that night he was to enter the unused door in the left wing, which was to be previously unlocked for him, and was to wait on the staircase until Mrs. Herodotus was able to steal down to him and obtain the jewels. That plan was upset by Tufnell finding the door unlocked, and locking it again before his arrival. When he did arrive he found himself unable to get in. "Stop a moment," exclaimed Musard hoarsely. "This story goes too deep for me. Who is this man? Do you know him? Has he anything to do with the murder?" "Yes, I know him, and he has much to do with the murder," said the detective. "Shall I mention his name, Mr. Herodotus?" Phil nodded, as though he were unable to speak. "The man is Captain Nepcote." Nepcote! A swift flash of wrath came into Musard's heavy dark eyes as he uttered the name. Then, in a wider understanding of the sordid interpretation of Colwyn's story, he hesitatingly added, "I think I see. It was Nepcote's revolver. Was it he who shot Violet?" Before answering that question it is necessary to give Nepcote's explanation of his actions on that night. His own story is that he did not enter the house. He says that while he was waiting outside he heard a scream followed by a shot, and he then hid in the woods in front of the house until he thought it safe to return to London. He declares he is innocent of the murder. "That is a lie!" Phil burst forth. "Who will believe him?" He stopped abruptly, and turned fiercely to Colwyn. "How do you know Nepcote said this?" he demanded. "Because I saw him the night before I left London. He told me everything, and gave me the necklace." "And you let him go again? Are you mad?" Phil was on his feet, shaking with excitement. "What makes you think I let him go?" retorted Colwyn coldly. "You need not be afraid that your wife's murderer will escape justice. Nepcote is lying ill of pneumonia in a private hospital in London. He can only escape by death. But the manner in which you have received this information suggests to my mind that you have had your own suspicions of Nepcote all along, but have kept them to yourself." "I cannot conceive that to be any business of yours," replied the young man, with a touch of hauteur. "It seems to me that it is, in the circumstances. You came to me seeking my assistance because you believed in the innocence of Hazel Rath, but, as I am now convinced, you suppressed information which pointed to Captain Nepcote. I told you all that I thought necessary. You told me that your wife had been shot with Nepcote's revolver. Is that what you mean?" "Yes. That was sufficient to put you on the track without taking you into my confidence about something which affected my honor and the honor of my family." Phil turned very pale as he uttered the last words. Perhaps Phil should have told you, but you must make allow, commenced Musard. But Colwyn silenced him with an imperative glance. At the time you came to see me, you believed that Captain Nepcote had murdered your wife, he said, facing Phil. I did. Do you mind telling me now on what ground you based that belief? I fail to recognize your right to cross-question me, replied the young man haughtily, but I will answer your question. It was for the reason that you have supposed. I suspected his relations with my wife. There was his revolver to prove that he had been in her room. I do not know why Hazel Rath carried it away. Perhaps I could enlighten you on that point. As you knew so much, it is equally certain that you knew about your wife's missing necklace, though you did not tell me of that, either. But I will not go into that now. I wish to hurry on to my conclusion. I have at least done all that you asked me to do. I have proved Hazel Rath's innocence. But I have proved more than that. Captain Nepcote is also innocent. I should like to hear how you arrive at that conclusion. Phil strove to utter the words calmly, but his trembling lips revealed his inward agitation. His story, as told to me, fits in with facts of which he could have had no knowledge. He says he found the door of the left wing locked, and we know it was locked by Tufnell more than an hour before. He states that after the shot he hid in the woods in front of the house. It was there Tufnell thought he saw somebody hiding. It was there I found a scrap of khaki adhering to a bramble at the spot indicated by Nepcote as his hiding place. Tufnell admits that he called out an alarm when his eye fell on the crouching figure. Nepcote says that he saw Tufnell, heard his cry, and plunged deeper into the bushes for safety. Tufnell returned along the carriage drive 20 minutes afterwards with Detective Caldew and Sergeant Lum. Nepcote heard the crunch of their feet on the gravel as they passed. His accuracy in these details, which he could not possibly have known, helped me to the conclusion that the whole of his story was true. He had plenty of time to commit the murder, nevertheless, said Phil. It is useless for you to try and cling to that theory now. There was something in the tone in which these words were uttered which caused the young man to look swiftly at the detective from beneath furrowed brows. You seem to have constituted yourself the champion of this scoundrel, he said, in a changed harsh voice. Musard glanced from one to the other with troubled eyes. There was a growing hint of menace in their conversation which his mind, deeply agitated by the strange disclosures of the evening, could only fear without fathoming. I do not understand you, he said simply, addressing himself to Colwyn. If this man Nepcote did not commit the murder, who did? Was it not he who was in the bedroom when Hazel Rath went there in the dark? No, said Colwyn, it was not he. Who was the man, then, who clutched Hazel Rath by the throat? Persisted Musard. It was no man, responded Colwyn, in a gloomy voice. That was the point which baffled me for hours when I thought the whole truth was within my grasp. Again and again I sought vainly for the answer, until, in mental weariness and utter despair, I was tempted to believe that the powers of evil had combined to shield the perpetrator of this atrocious murder from justice. Then it came to me, the last horrible revelation in this hellish plot. It was the hand of the dying woman, spasmodically clutching at the empty air in her death agonies, which accidentally came in contact with Hazel Rath's throat, and loosened her brooch. Oh, this is too terrible, murmured Musard. His swarthy face showed an ashen tint. What do you mean? What are you keeping back? Where does all this lead to? It leads to the exposure of the trick of a false report by which the murderer sought to procure an alibi and revenge. What do you mean? What have you found out? Cried Phil, leaping to his feet and facing Colwyn. As he uttered the words, a loud shot in the room overhead rang out with startling distinctness. "I mean that," said Colwyn quietly. Even up to the moment of his experiment he was not quite certain. But in the one swift glance they exchanged, everything was revealed to each of them. Before Musard could frame the question which trembled on his amazed lips, Phil spoke. His face was very white, and his dark eyes blazing. "Yes. That is it. You have found me out." His voice, deepened to a bitter intensity, had a deliberate intonation which was almost solemn. "What did they do to me? Shall I ever forget my feelings when, unobserved by them, I caught them in the house one day, whispering and kissing? I walked straight out into the woods to be alone with my shame. My brain was on fire. When I recalled his lecherous looks and her wanton meaning glances, I was tempted to destroy myself in misery and despair. Human nature, ah, God, what a beastly thing it is. I had trusted them both so utterly, I loved her so deeply. How had they repaid my trust and love? By deceiving me, under my eyes, in my own home, before my marriage was 3 months old. That night I dreamt of obscene things. I awoke with their images hovering by my bedside, looking at me with sneering eyes, mocking me with lewd gestures. "Your honor and the honor of the Herodotus, where is it?" they kept repeating, "sold by the wanton you have made your wife. What is honor to the lust of the flesh? There is nothing so strong in the world." But as I watched them the ceiling rolled away, and in the darkness of the sky a stern and implacable face appeared. And it said, "There is one thing stronger than honor, stronger even than the lust of the flesh, and that is death." It was the answer to a question I had been asking myself ever since I knew. I got up, and sat by the open window, to plan how I should kill them both. But I wanted the man to feel more than a swift thunderstroke of mortal agony. I wished to make him suffer as I had suffered, but at first I could see no way. Then it came to me in the strangest way, a light, a direction, a guide. I had been smoking as I sat there thinking, smoking cigarettes which I lit with a little automatic lighter I always used. I must have laid it down carelessly, for I was interrupted in my meditations by the sight of a thin trail of vapor ascending from the window ledge. I had failed to put the extinguisher on the lighter, and the wick had gone on burning. As I watched the red spark crawling almost imperceptibly along the yellow wick, there dawned in my mind the first glimmering of the idea of a slow match and a delayed report. Bit by bit it took form, and the means of my revenge was made clear to me. I went back to bed and slept soundly. I was in no hurry to act. There was much to think over, much to do, before the plan was finally perfected. I carried out experiments in the gunroom when everybody was in bed, secure in the knowledge that no report, however loud, could penetrate from those thick walls upstairs. While I was making ready, I watched them both. Not a furtive glance or caress passed between them which I did not see. The night my aunt asked Violet about the necklace, I suspected that it was no longer in her possession. I guessed that by her evasive answers and telltale face. When she left the room and went upstairs, I crept after her in the shadows and followed her to the door of Nepcote's room. I listened to their conversation. I heard him promise her to return secretly to the moat house on the following night with the necklace. My heart leapt as I listened. I believed that I had him. I stole away quietly without waiting to learn any more, but I stayed up till far into the night preparing my final plans. My intention was to shoot her just before dinner, and arrange for the false report to explode after he had arrived and hidden himself in the old staircase, waiting for her to go to him. Then, when the report startled everybody in the dining room, I intended to be the first to rush upstairs, and lead the search in the direction of the old staircase. I would have had him by the throat, before he had time to get away. How would he have been able to account for his secret presence in the house when her jewels were in his pocket and her dead body upstairs, close to where he was hiding? I had intended to kill Violet with a small revolver which I had bought in a second-hand place at London last winter, but Nepcote's carelessness in leaving his own revolver in the gunroom gave the last finishing touch to my plan. I could scarcely believe my luck when I found it. It seemed as though he himself were playing into my hands. I hid it away, expecting that there would be inquiries, but there were none. He had forgotten all about it. It was strange, too, that Violet herself helped by telling my aunt before dinner on the night of her pretended illness that she did not wish to be disturbed by anybody. That removed a defect in my arrangements which had caused me much anxious thought. I had feared that somebody, probably a servant, might enter the room in the period between the first and second reports. It was a chance I could not afford to overlook, and I could see no way of guarding against it except by locking the door, which I did not want to do. I wanted to leave the door partly open so as to make sure of the second report penetrating to the dining room downstairs. When my aunt gave me Violet's message in the library shortly before dinner, I knew that the moment had arrived. The altered arrangements for an earlier dinner cost me a moment's perplexity, but no more. One cannot hurry one's own guests, and I knew it would be impossible to get dinner over as quickly as my aunt anticipated. If it were ending too quickly for my purpose, it would be an easy matter to introduce a subject which would set somebody talking. That, as you know, is what actually happened. After my aunt left me, I waited until the last possible moment before slipping upstairs. The revolver and the pistol were locked away in my own bedroom in readiness. I got them out. The pistol was completely prepared except for the cap. I had bound a 12-inch tinder wick to the stock in order to allow for a delay of nearly 50 minutes between the lighting and the report. I knew that Nepcote expected to arrive at the moat house by 7:30 at the latest, but I gave him a margin of a few minutes for unexpected delays. I put the pistol in my pocket, and wrapping the revolver in a silk muffler to deaden the report, went swiftly to my wife's room. I closed the door behind me as I entered. She was lying on the bed with her eyes closed, and did not hear me approach. That helped me. Can you understand my feelings? I was about to destroy something I loved better than life itself, but it was not she who was lying on the bed. She had died by her own act, leaving behind her another woman whose life was a living lie, who was so corrupt and worthless as to be unfit to live. It was that I was going to destroy. I felt no compunction, no remorse. As I placed the muzzle of the revolver against her breast, she opened her eyes in terror, and saw me. I pulled the trigger quickly. As I did so, I heard the dinner gong sound downstairs. The muffled report made less noise than the clapping of a pair of hands. I knew that faint sound would not be heard downstairs. She never moved, and I thought she was dead. I bent over the fireplace, shook some caps out of the butt of the pistol, and placed one on the nipple. Then I lit a match and started my prepared fuse. It was an easy matter to place the pistol in position at the top of the grate. The difficulty of recovering it subsequently was not made manifest to me until after my illness, although my previous secret examination of the grate had convinced me that the recoil of the explosion would cause the pistol to fall to the bottom of the chimney behind the grate. When I had placed the pistol in position, I turned off the electric light, and opened the window to allow the fumes of the burning wick to escape. Then I hurried downstairs. I was not in the room 3 minutes altogether. I saw nobody on my way down. Nearly everybody had gone in to dinner, but I was in time to sit down with the others. I felt quite cold and collected as I sat at the dinner table waiting for the moment of my vengeance. I felt as though I was under the control of some force immensely stronger than myself, which held me firm with giant hands while the minutes slowly ebbed away. I am sure there was nothing unusual in my behavior. I pretended to eat, and joined in the conversation around me. The report did not come at the moment I anticipated, but I was not perturbed at the delay. My experiments had taught me the difficulty of fixing an explosion for an exact period. The time was in general approximately the same, but there were reasons which caused a slight difference. The wick always burnt at a uniform rate. The trouble was with the string. Sometimes it was slow in catching. Sometimes the pressure of the string partly extinguished the wick and made combustion slower as it neared the point of contact. Once I tied the string so tight that the wick went out altogether just before reaching the string. But I had taken measures to overcome these little irregularities, and to make sure of the string catching readily I had rubbed a little petrol on it where it crossed the wick. But it was the scream before the report which upset my calculations and almost caused me to collapse. When that terrible cry rang out, my false strength fled from me, leaving me weak and trembling. I think I should have betrayed myself if the report had not followed so quickly, throwing everybody into the same state of confusion as myself. I do not know how I managed to make my limbs carry me upstairs with the others. I did not know what had happened. My brain refused to act. I was conscious of nothing except that a great will seemed turning inside my head, tightening all my nerves to such taut agony that I could hardly refrain from crying aloud. What I said or did when I found myself in the bedroom I do not know. When I saw that everything was as I had arranged, my mind began swinging like a pendulum towards my revenge, and I struggled to lead the search towards the staircase. But I was unable to move. I was like a man in a dream, encompassed by invisible obstacles. Then the wheel in my head suddenly relaxed, I felt the room and its objects slipping from me, and everything went black. You know about my illness. It was not until I was supposed to be recovering that the power of clear thought came back to me. There were days when my brain was numb and powerless, like that of one newly awakened from a terrible nightmare, striving to recall what had happened. Then one day the veil was drawn, and I remembered everything. My aunt was in the room, and I questioned her. She brought Musard to me, and from him I learnt the truth. Intuitively I realized what had happened. Hazel Rath had gone to the room for some unknown reason, had seen my wife lying there, and screamed. Then, hardly conscious of what she was doing, she picked up the revolver I had left lying by the bedside, and ran out of the room in fright. I was even able to divine a reason for her silence under the accusation of murder. She felt that nobody would believe her story, especially after the history of her mother's past was brought to light. As I turned over what they had told me and realized that my own secret was safe, I thought I saw the way to accomplish my revenge and save Hazel Rath. Up till then the revolver had not been identified as Nepcote's. It seemed to me that the mere disclosure of that fact was sufficient to direct attention to Nepcote and bring to light his movements on that night. But the detective who came to see me about the revolver was too foolish and obstinate to grasp the importance of my information. It was then I decided to go to you. It was daring, perhaps, but it seemed safe enough to me. I was determined to entangle Nepcote, and to free Hazel Rath. I told you no more than I had told to the other detective. I had powerful motives for reticence. If I had told you more you would have seen that I had an ulterior reason for directing attention to Nepcote. I had not the least fear that you would discover my secret, but the knowledge, if imparted to you, would have weakened the impression I wanted to convey by suggesting to your mind that I was actuated by hatred of Nepcote. Besides, I did not wish any living being to know of my shame. I believed that I could accomplish my revenge without its ever being known. I thought Nepcote would prefer to perish as the victim of circumstances rather than incur public opprobrium by a defense which he knew would never be believed. The actual facts against him were too strong. He could neither extenuate nor deny them. He could not explain his lying telegrams, his secret return, his presence in the moat house, his possession of the necklace, the revolver in the bedroom where the body was. Therefore, it was only necessary to give you a starting point, because discovery was inevitable where so much was hidden. I saw to it that the loss of the necklace was discovered after your arrival. That was all you needed to know. I do not know what oversight of mine put you on the track of the truth. There was one, but I do not see how that could have helped you. It was not until the following afternoon in the gunroom, when Musard drew your attention to the pistol case, that I remembered that the pistol I had used was still at the back of the fireplace upstairs, where apparently it had lain undiscovered during my illness. I had taken the precaution of concealing the key of the case, but I decided to restore the pistol that night after you left. It was more difficult to recover than I anticipated, owing to the depth of the space behind the grate. I had to push back the bedstead and use the tongs before I could reach it. I believe it would have lain there undiscovered for years. There was nothing else that I can recall, except that when I restored the pistol I saw I had left the end of one of my experimental tinder lighter wicks lying in the case. But I do not wish to know how you found out, now that Nepcote has escaped. I have nothing left to live for. The doctor thinks I am recovering, but I knew that it was only the hope of revenge which kept me going. Now that is gone, I have not long to live. I rejoice that it is so. But whatever had happened, I would have saved that poor girl, Hazel Rath. I ask you to believe that. Violet. He ceased, and with a weary gesture, let his head fall on his outstretched arms, as though the strength which bore him up while he told his tale deserted him when he had made manifest the truth. His two listeners sat for some minutes in silence, each engrossed in his own thoughts. Musard stared gloomily at Phil with unseeing eyes. He was as one who had passed through unimagined horrors in a space not to be measured by time, to emerge with a fatigued sense of the black malignity of unknown gods who create the passions of humanity for their own brutal sport. His moving lips betrayed a consciousness loosened from its moorings, tossed in a turbulent sea of disaster. Then they formed the whispered words. The house was founded in horror and it ends in horror. So the old tradition comes true. The next moment he turned his eyes on Colwyn with a look askance, as though he saw in him the instrument of this misery. Why did Hazel Rath keep silence? He asked. Women have made greater sacrifices for love, Colwyn gently replied. Hazel Rath loved him, and kept silence to shield him. She would not have spoken at all if suspicion had not fastened on Nepcote, and even when she did speak she kept something back. We may now learn later what actually passed between Hazel and Mrs. Herodotus in the bedroom that night. My own opinion is that, while Hazel was bending over her, the dying woman whispered the name of her murderer. What are you going to do now? Musard abruptly demanded, in sudden change of mood, speaking as though there were nobody present but their two selves. There is only one thing to do. Do you mean to let the world know the truth, to give him up to justice? What other course is there open for me to pursue? Said Colwyn sadly. I cannot see what earthly purpose will be gained by making this horrible story public. Consider, I beg of you, all the circumstances before you inflict this dreadful sorrow and scandal on an honored family. It is because I have to consider all the circumstances that I have no option. Is there no other way? Persisted Musard. He is mad. He must have been possessed. You heard his story, his hallucinations were those of an insane person. He had some justification. He would never have committed this terrible deed of his own free will. Colwyn did not reply. It was useless to point out that there is no such thing as free will in human affairs, and that if Philip Herodotus had been impelled to his crime by the evil force of passions which were stronger than the restraining power of human reason, he must pay the full price demanded by humanity for the only safeguard of its supremacy. There was the sound of an opening door and footsteps outside, and a voice called. Phil. Vincent. Where are you? They have returned. Musard excitedly exclaimed. What are they to be told? I cannot say, replied Colwyn, casting a somber glance at Phil's drooping and motionless figure. There was something new in his posture, a stark stillness which arrested his eye. He stepped quickly to his side and bent over him. He is dead, he said. Dead? My God! Impossible. It is quite true. It is better so. Vincent. Miss Herodotus' voice sounded not far away. She is coming here. Quick, what am I to say to her? I cannot tell you, responded Colwyn, with another glance at the still form. It was he who called me in to solve this mystery, and I have done what he asked. I will leave you to tell her what you will, but I cannot keep silence afterwards where the liberty of innocent people is involved. Justice is as impersonal as truth herself. Vincent. This time the voice sounded just outside the door. I must stop her, she must not come in here, said Musard, starting up. But he was too late. The door opened, and Miss Herodotus stood in the doorway. Her startled eyes took in the agitated face of Musard, and then traveled to the drooping attitude of the figure at the table. She went quickly past the two men, and bent over her nephew. As she did so, she sobbed aloud. All the pity and pathos of a woman, all the misery and mystery of a broken heart, welled forth in her faint mournful cry. This will kill her, said Musard savagely. But Colwyn felt that it would not be so. As he turned from the room, leaving the living and the dead together, he knew that when the first bitterness of the shock was over, and she was faced again with the consciousness of duty, she would call on her abiding faith to help her to wear, without flinching, the heavy gray garment of life. The end.